Thanks, Rod. I presume I'm loud enough for everyone to hear. So first of all, thanks everyone for coming. It's nerve-wracking putting up your project for review from the public after a year of working on it and being very close to it. But it's also exciting as well. And it's when I got told that there was going to be 50 to 79 people coming, I had a bit of a heart attack. I was like, oh God, I hope I've done a decent enough job to, earn people's attention. So really thank you for coming. And obviously it's just good to have interest in the energy transition broadly and climate and energy policy as well, given its importance. And I guess that kind of relates to the first slide I wanted to show you. So the context of this project is the Paris Agreements, which was signed in 2015 and ratified in 2016. So as we know, the goal of this agreement is to limit temperature increase to 2 degrees and aspirationally limit it to 1.5 degrees. So, hold on, just fix my mic. So obviously you can see from that graphic that we were kind of running out of time. And so this is an urgent problem that we're dealing with. And the purpose of Paris is to stop that increase. So I thought that's an interesting way to set the scene. Like I'm assuming everyone here is kind of interested in this question, how to stop that constant rise. So in terms of the structure of the presentation, for the first 10 minutes, I'm just going to explain what I'm doing with this research. And then for the second 10 minutes, I'll explain why I'm doing the research. And then lastly, I'll explain how I'm going to do the research. So the how is quite important, and that'll cover method, data sources, and project plan before giving a final summary. So this is my research question. How was Australia's INDC for the Paris Agreement developed? And I also have several sub-questions, which aren't up there just to keep things nice and focused. But the several sub-questions are really important. So this main research question will guide the whole project, but the several sub-questions, so the first one is, who were the actors involved and what were their roles and how did they interact? And the remaining 3 sub-questions are about research use, which is really my object of analysis or my interest. So these sub-questions are, how was research used in developing the INDC? What types of research were used in developing the INDC? How was research used? I think I mentioned that, but I mean, that's important. And what factors influenced research use? So as you can kind of tell from that outline, this project is about the role of research use in the development of the INDC. So in terms of the time frame, I'm going to focus on the period between December 2011, when the INDCs kind of became a idea, which came out of Durban in COP17. So beginning in 2011 and going to 2015, that kind of window is the period of time I'm interested in. Because we know in 2015, Australia submitted its INDC to Paris. So it's important to define what I mean by research. Research gets used quite loosely in the literature, so I wanted to really establish a clear definition. So I've defined it as the systematic investigation towards increasing the sum of knowledge. So this is a broad definition. It captures academic research, research by think tanks and NGOs, and official government research. And it covers social science and natural science research. So previous studies and empirical work in the area of study I'm looking at, which is basically policy science and then research use. They tend to focus on social science research, but I'm interested in all kinds of research and how they were put into the development of Australia's INDC. Also, this definition doesn't capture expert advice. And I think expert advice will be an important factor in the development of Australia's INDC. And expert advice means the government, for example, asking experts to come in and give them advice on their on the options or policy that they're working on. So while I'm not capturing expert advice in this definition, I still intend to identify whether it was used through the data collection of this project. So moving on to the overall project design. So I'm going to use a single case study design, and the case study is the development of Australia's INDC. So I've chosen this case study for 3 reasons. First, Australian climate and energy policy is very contentious, as we all know. And compared to other countries, it's more contentious as well. So I'm from New Zealand. Our climate and energy policy is fairly prosaic in comparison. We have an ETS, it's been there for a long time, and it's fairly settled, although they're tweaking it. I used to work in the UK, and again, there is contentiousness around energy policy, mainly price, but it's still less contentious than Australia. So Australia is a really interesting case study. And the second reason is the change in government in 2013 from a centre-left Labour government to a centre-right coalition government. And so I think that adds another interesting dimension to the project. So one of the defining issues of that campaign was the carbon tax. The opposition coalition party campaigned on getting rid of it, and after the election repealed it. And so you can see the passion in these 2 pictures. Interestingly, as a side point, when I was looking at these images on Google, the anger, especially that lady down the bottom, who looks like she's about to sneeze maybe, but very angry, determined faces on the left, but on the right, more subdued. And that could be an artifact of when the picture was taken, or it could be an indication of the intent behind each side who are fighting for what they wanted. So this political conflict, illustrated by this diagram, this picture, I think it will have influenced potentially how research was used in the development of the INDC, which was taking place during this period. And this case study will aim to clarify that. So, and the third reason is Australia, being a transparent and open government, allows me to access unreleased government documents through the Freedom of Information Act, which is great. So that will help ensure the case study is as detailed as possible. And that's one of the goals of case study research, is to really drill down and get as much information on what's happening as possible. And the Freedom of Information Act is something I'm going to use to try and do that. There's also an important limitation. So you're probably thinking, so he's looking at Australia, but why not do like a comparative case study, like to another country? That's always an interesting, it's always interesting to compare things. The main reason I limited it to Australia was for project feasibility reasons. Just because when I initially pitched the project, it was very large. And then as part of this year, I've tried to narrow it down to something feasible. So it's a good idea, but not feasible, unfortunately. So what contributions will this project make? So I've got 3 up here: theoretical, empirical, and practical. So in terms of the theoretical contribution, I'm aiming to take competing explanations from the literature, the research use literature, and I'll discuss them shortly. And then I'm going to do the case study, and then I'm going to evaluate those different explanatory frameworks against the case study data. So this project will be useful in assessing the value of each of those descriptive and explanatory frameworks against an Australian case study. Secondly, the empirical data. So there is already empirical research, and I'm going to cover that again shortly. This project will contribute to that empirical data with an Australian case study. And thirdly, and this is my kind of idealistic or aspirational aim, I really would like to do research that identifies ways that research use could be improved. Because if I can identify ways that research use can be improved within the Australian context, and then potentially lessons that can be applied to other countries, there's the potential for accelerating the energy transition, at least in a small way. And therefore it contributes to that first horrible GIF of the expanding temperature, which is something we're all concerned about. For example, I might find that Australian public officials don't use research optimally. Maybe they don't have access to the best research, or they don't have time to use the best research, and that's negatively affecting policy. And perhaps these barriers could be broken down in the future. So now going back to the theoretical contribution. So there is a variety of competing explanations about how research is used in policymaking. And I'm just going to cover the rational model, the incrementalist model, and the advocacy coalition framework. So this is the rational model. If you've ever worked in policy, you've probably seen this a million times. It's got 5 stages: identify the problem and or the goals, identify ways to solve the problem and or achieve the goals, evaluate consequences from each strategy and their probabilities, and then implement the desired plan to solve the problem and or achieve the goals. And then finally, you monitor the effect of the plan. So in this model, research use occurs at stages 2 and 3. And from this model, we can see that research use is orderly, systematic, and comprehensive. So it basically, research use is always going to occur at those stages. And the way that the steps are laid out kind of implies that you're going to look broadly and use research to do that process. So we can expect that when this model is followed, research is probably going to have a big impact on policy outcomes. So I then tried to find an example from the literature about basically an example of this being used. And it's actually very difficult. And that's probably because it's a normative model as opposed to a descriptive model. And when I was a policy analyst, we were trained to follow this model, but it was very hard to achieve in practice. And this is a bit of an embarrassing thing to admit, but why not? I don't ever remember using research like literature, because I don't think I ever had time. We were on very short time frames. So there you go. So the second model is a bit more maybe realistic, the incrementalist model. So this was developed by a chap called Lindholm in 1959 due to his dissatisfaction with the rational model, the previous one. So he thought this model was a better description of actual policy making. Policy isn't developed in a linear way, in a nice kind of 5-stage process. It's developed in an incremental way, like a building block approach, hence the building blocks. So if a country has, say, an emissions trading scheme, and they decide there's a problem with it, The incrementalist model would predict that the policymakers' behavior would be to tweak the ETS based on a consideration of what was practically and politically possible, as opposed to going back to a kind of first principles approach. But in terms of research use, which is the focus of this project, you can also, you can't see it from this diagram, but it's basically less systematic than the rational model. And it's tactical. So in this incrementalist model, you have policy actors vying for preference for their preferred policy, and including the policymakers themselves. And they use research tactically in order to achieve their preferred objectives. So research isn't used rationally, systematically, or comprehensively in this model, and therefore, from a rationalist perspective, policy outcomes are unlikely to be optimal. Another way of looking at it is this. So this model is also known as muddling through. So you have the beginning, the muddle, and the end. And thinking about American politics, Washington is probably in here somewhere at the moment, because their government is shut down. So if that's not what muddling through is, I don't know what it is. Okay, and then the last model I want to talk about is the advocacy coalition framework. So I got a lot of heat for using this diagram in a previous session. So I've simplified it a lot, and you still can't see the text. So I'm going to walk you through it. I'm going to walk you through it and see how we go. So basically, the blue part is the policy subsystem. And in this case, for me, this project, the policy subsystem is the climate and energy policy in Australia. So the policy subsystem is geographically bounded, so it's Australia. And you basically have policy participants from all levels of government, multiple interest groups interacting, the media, research institutions, lobbyists. So these groups form themselves into coalitions. So we've got coalition A here, coalition B here. These coalitions have beliefs and resources. And through those beliefs and resources, and one of the resources is research, which is important. They form strategies. And then they compete together in a kind of, the way I think about it is Game of Thrones, but that's because I watch too much TV. But they compete together to basically get their preferred policy outcome. So in this model, research use is kind of highlighted as an important variable or input into the process. Research can profoundly affect people's beliefs, and that can lead to dramatic changes in coalitions. So a classic example might be Silent Spring, which came out in 1962, I think. I can't quite remember. But that became a rallying point for the environmental movement and led to the creation of the EPA in the US. So that was a new piece of research which basically had a big impact on the policy subsystem. So you've got the subsystem over here, and then you've got basically the society is represented by external events here, which are things like changes in public opinion, and then the relatively stable parameters, for example, the attributes of the problem area. So an example for this project would be climate change is a very, very, very long-term problem. It's not going away. And then, as I just mentioned, the external events are shifts in the wider society that then affect the policy subsystem. So the goal of this project is going to be to evaluate these types of models against the data I clicked from the Australian case study. Okay, and so this is the empirical side of things. So I'm also hoping to make an empirical contribution to the literature on research use. So there are already interesting literature on this topic, and I've got 3 examples highlighted. The first is from the US. So 2 researchers called Avi and Dash surveyed 234 senior US national security policymakers to find out how they used research. And they found some very interesting things. So they found policymakers used newspapers as much as classified information, which is fairly surprising. They also found that the more educated policymakers were, the less likely they were to rely on the internet, which is also interesting. And perhaps less surprising, they found that policymakers preferred kind of qualitative academic social science research as opposed to econometric, heavily quantitative research. So those were some very interesting findings, and that's a fairly recent study as well. Second study, so that study spurred another study by UK scholars Talbot and Talbot in 2014. They also found that 55% of, so they looked at senior civil servants across the board, not just national security policymakers. They found that against their assumption that they wouldn't be reading journals because they were just too busy and there's academic paywalls, they found that actually 55% of senior civil servants did read academic journals. They don't know if they looked at just the abstracts or the whole articles, but they do know that they were reading them, and they were surprised by that. And so was I, to be honest. So, I mean, that was a very interesting finding. Senior civil servants also thought that social science had a lot of impact. 31% of them said that. And 57% said it had some impact. So we can see there that the policymakers themselves think that social science research was influential, which is, again, interesting. And then the third example is from Australia. And that was a very large survey of over 2,000 Australian public officials. And an interesting finding here was that 58% of respondents used online bibliographic databases. And that's not Google, that's in addition to Google. So, and that was on a less than monthly basis, so it wasn't like every week they were doing it, but it still demonstrates that they had access to academic literature and that they were using it. And 60% of them reported drawing on that research in their written documents, that's quite a high number. But in terms of the impact on policy, less emphatic results there. So the results suggested that the public officials, even though they were using it in their written documents, they thought it had maybe an occasional impact on policy. So I want this project to contribute to that empirical literature. And then lastly, just in terms of the practical contribution, I've kind of covered this already, but if I can identify ways that research use can be improved with this project, I think that would be a great outcome. I may find that Australian public officials working on climate and energy policy for institutional reasons, for political reasons, don't have time to use academic research, not academic research, just research generally. And one implication of that would be that academics need to communicate their research to public officials better, potentially. Or alternatively, not putting all the blame on the academics, that public officials need to make more use of that research being generated by academics. So I'll now cover how I'm going to be doing this project. So again, it's quite hard to read, but I'll walk you through it. So the first stage of the project is going to be documentary analysis, which is in green. So that means basically collecting and analysing documents, such as published and unreleased government documents via the Freedom of Information Act. So I'm going to be using as my data sources the Australian Parliamentary Library, government websites, government archives via the FOI, news articles and secondary sources. And I'm aiming to do this first because I think it will help establish a solid foundation for the semi-structured interviews that will follow. So by developing a solid understanding of how Australian public officials use research via documentary analysis, it should provide a solid foundation for me to engage with the interviewees that I'm aiming to talk to. Basically, I'll know what I'm talking about. And research has shown that when you're doing interviews, interviewees are more likely to engage with you and be free and frank if you can show that you can kind of engage on a peer-to-peer level, as opposed to being someone who doesn't really know what they're talking about. So in doing so, I should be able to elicit more interesting and novel information from my interviewees. So in terms of the interviewees, so that's going to be the second stage. So I'm going to interview policymakers from DFATS, DPMC, Treasury, Department of the Environment and Energy, and the Climate Change Authority. I'm also aiming to interview experts from the Climate College, which is very convenient since I'm situated here, and any other experts who may have insights into how the INDC was developed. And again, I'm aiming to interview politicians, which is going to be the fun part, I suppose. So because of the change of government, this is a very good case study because the Labor government, a lot of those politicians are now retired. So Julia Gillard, Kevin Rudd, and what was his name? Greg Combet. Since they're retired, I imagine they'll be easier to access and therefore more free and frank. Hopefully, that's my idea anyway. And then with the coalition government, it's going to be a lot more difficult because they tend to be pushing a line and more careful with what they say. So once I've done the interviews, I'll code that data using NVivo, which is qualitative software, so I can analyze it. So this is the project plan. It's basically quite simple, split into 3 areas. So the first area I've now basically finished. So that's about research design. And we're almost at January 2018. Well, we are at January 2018. So that's done. So then the next year will be data collection. So I intend to do the documentary collection and analysis in the first half of the year, and also establish contact with interviewees and hopefully set up times for interviews in the second half of the year. And I think that will be a tricky process. And in the second half of the year, I will conduct my interviews and continue my documentary analysis. And in the final year, I'll be doing my analysis and writing. So just to summarize what I've covered. So the research question is, how was Australia's INDC for the Paris Agreement developed? I am going to use a single case study design, which is the development of Australia's INDC. There'll be 3 contributions from the project. Theoretically, I'll be evaluating descriptive and explanatory theories from the research use literature. Empirically, I'll be providing an Australian case study to the research use literature. And practically, I'm hoping to identify ways that research use can be improved, and in doing so, potentially help move the transition along more quickly. The method I'm using is documentary analysis and semi-structured interviews, and I'm aiming to complete this project in June 2020. Thanks.
Thanks, Seb. So we now have some time for questions from the audience. Do we want to? There's a roaming mic, so.
Hi, my name is Seb Rattansen. I worked in policy and I wrote India's renewable energy policy by accident. I also advised government. So I know why, in actual fact, Kevin Rudd, started talking about the ETS because I advised Bruce Hawker, who was his advisor. And my advice to Bruce was, Australia is not ready. Don't go down a fixed carbon price towards an ETS. Now the question is this, and the issue was this: how do you define the beginning when you have a whole bunch of bureaucrats at state and federal level massaging the research to suit their own interests and to push their own agenda?
You sound like someone I should be interviewing. So I've missed the first half of the question. I got the second part. So you said, alluded to the fact that bureaucrats can massage information that they then present to politicians.
It's all about getting up the career ladder, isn't it? And research data, especially if you follow the research approaches and you reference all your documents, make everything look legit. I mean, have a look at the NEG, how many academics have been trolled out to talk about our water quality? Not me, because it's not policy.
I think that may go to Seb's point about which model is then applying in the way research is being used to develop the INDC, and what you're describing is more of the advocacy coalition model, where a particular coalition has formed a view and then seeks research to support that view, which is quite a common approach in policy. Yeah, good. So it would be interesting to see if Seb's results actually confirm your hypothesis on it.
Yeah, no, I think that is very interesting. I totally get the idea that bureaucrats are self-interested, and I think those models, I mean, the idea that they are self-interested in some cases, not always. But hopefully using those models will kind of guide my data collection in a way that I can pull out that kind of those interesting insights, because I think that's the first time I've heard anyone tell me that that's how that part of the policy came to be. So that's very interesting.
Look, I propose the renewable energy zone, literally providing up Australia or state 40 megawatt zones, self-generating and storage zones as far as 2008. I was talking to bureaucrats in the shell bit.
Well, we're not going to unpack the policy today, so yeah.
It tells you how long it takes over 10
Yeah.
years to actually get to the very beginning of when the bureaucrats should, define a policy start that actually makes sense in an energy transition context.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Yeah, it's a very good point.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah, Mike Delaney, what are the key decisions of government made in cabinet?
Most of the key decisions of governments are made in cabinet, and most of that information is cabinet in confidence. So a lot of the information that goes into that, you won't be able to get from an FOI.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. How do you propose to handle that?
Yeah, and this is often a question for researchers that they have to grapple with. So one of the ways I'm going to try and get around it is, as I said, the Labor government from the 2010 to 2013. So they're now out of power. So, and they're retired. So I'm hoping that they're going to be more free and frank, because they're not subject to cabinet confidentiality rules that the current coalition government is. And the other way is kind of by triangulation. So through the through the, yes, you're right that cabinet is confidential, but if I can access unreleased government documents that still provide evidence of, you know, how policy was developed or how it got to be, the kind of briefings that then go to cabinet, that kind of thing. So that will help answer that question without necessarily needing to get into this, kind of be a fly on the wall in cabinet. Hmm. Yeah, it's going to be a challenge. Yeah.
Thank you. The INDC development probably started after Labour left government. So maybe, do you want to broaden your research question to more like international climate targets? Because INDCs, when that was on the books for Australia, I remember that there was a relatively frantic search for how do you find possibly the lowest target that sounded the highest, and one of the
I think you mean the weakest.
the weakest, and the one theme that was then taken, well, we have to be comparable to somebody else out there, and that happened to be Barack Obama with a 26 to 28%, and then let's further weaken it a little bit by going to 2030 rather than 2025, what the US target was, and therefore by pointing to the yes and having the same nominal percentage there, they could politically get away with that target. So, but that was all in the coalition government, not the Labour. So what is the information you would elicit for the INDC process from the retired Labour politicians?
So I'm relying a little bit on my own personal experience here, but I assume that when Durban was over, the government, that, you know, the people that attended, the politicians that attended, the senior bureaucrats that attended Durban would have come back to Australia and set their climate and energy officials to work on developing some kind of preparatory targets, which wouldn't have been the same as the coalition's targets. So there should be a paper trail of policy development that occurred between 2011 and 2015. It might not have been the high level, you know, like the kind of information that you're talking about. But it doesn't seem likely to me that, and I could be wrong, it doesn't seem likely that the climate and energy officials would just be sitting around when the Durban COP's just been finished and there's an indication that that government needs to develop some policy around that. So,
are you talking at party level, or are you talking at, you know, what, I was working with Auckland Britain at the time, advising people at the federal levels. And the answer very simple is, we don't know what we're doing because we have no one who knows anything about it. So how can you make a policy when you have advisors advising the ministers? They don't know.
Is this for the previous Labour government?
This is for right through up to Gillard.
Yeah.
Gillard was pushed into.
But this is still the kind of story that I'd like to tell with this research. So if the research uncovers that there was no policy development, and I'm able to systematically demonstrate that, then I think that's quite an interesting.
I was advising Auckland and the advisors at that time.
Yeah, like I need to interview the thing.
Well, evidence and knowledge aren't always necessary conditions for a policy, but there's,
Thanks, Seb, for outlining your project. A little bit of follow-up. It raises a question to me. Have you thought about extending, well, seeing if you can extend your sort of interviewees to include advisors to ministers and the like? Because that advice, on the sort of briefings that go from ministers' private offices, isn't going to be captured in the same freedom of information sort of legislation as you would be able to capture advice from the departmental side.
Right.
But it might be possible to sort of arrange interviews with advisors, particularly if they've moved into other areas or they're retired, and that could be a really valuable source of information as well.
That sounds like a very good idea, and I'm hoping to do that this year in the first 6 months, is like identify different layers of like policy advisors, not just the people at the top, but all the down the hierarchy, because you can get a lot of interesting information that way. So I think that's a really good idea. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
So we have time for maybe one, or in the middle at the back. Take two more, one down the front. So.
Yeah, given that that science is all about evidence, not belief, how do you minimise the use of belief in making policies?
That's a good question. I think that's like a normative question, right? Like what you should be doing. When I was doing my research for this project, I kind of became a fan of the evidence-based policymaking approach, which is, it's essentially a normative approach to policymaking, in which you develop policy not based on belief, but always on evidence. And the UK's Blair government in the late 90s really pushed this. It's spread globally. So New Zealand has it, Australia has it. So everyone's pushing this idea of evidence-based policy. So how do you get belief out of policy? You say that it's wrong, and then you tell, you kind of push a position of evidence-based policymaking, which requires people to subscribe to it.
You get more respect for science, because at the moment there's a problem with the lack of respect for science.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. Yeah.
Sorry to contradict that. The tenor of the Liberal Party, of course, it is science-based, political science. Alexander Downer, who is now the hero of the West, I suppose, and he made that point. He said, the only science we're interested in is political science. We don't care less about it. It's working about the numbers to move the election. So if you're talking about science, that's what it's about.
Yeah, one of the components of evidence, I guess. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, it's a cynic. I think it's a depressing view of the current political situation. The whole post-truth, fake news thing that's been spreading from the US. But I'm like a child of the Enlightenment. I think research and evidence and science is what's got us here today. And if we're going to stop that graph from getting to 2 degrees, we have to keep following that and pushing it and advocating for it.
So last question in front of you.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. So kind of stemming off that cynical discussion we were just having, in terms of your practical contribution, are you intending just to identify those pitfalls in the system, or actual ways that you can overcome that? Because just to me, it seems unlikely that politicians will make more of an effort to look at research, or that academics will try and make it easier. Yeah, I don't know if you're also intending to implement strategies.
No, so I was kind of aiming for my discussion section to look at lessons learned. There is a huge literature on how the research policymaking nexus can be improved. Some people focus on policymakers need to do a better job. Some say that researchers need to communicate their research better and make it shorter and more concise and more like story-based or whatever. So there's a huge amount of research on that, and I'm hoping to draw on that in the discussion section to see, okay, so I've got the data from the Australian case study. How does that compare to what previous researchers have found in terms of improving how research is used in policy?
So is it more to pinpoint that one, like those main strategies that can be used, but not necessarily to follow through and implement?
No, not following through and implementing. That'll be someone else's PhD. Yeah, but it's a really good point. Yeah.
Good. Well, we need to wind up here. So let's join together and thank Seb again. And thanks all for coming. We'll test out in 2 years' time just where he is on the Enlightenment versus realist spectrum. So. No.
There's a pair of keys here found on one of the chairs.